Okay,
Um,
I'm here with Chris Branciere, and we're going to do a discussion about vegans and empathy studies and whether those empathy studies lead to better human-to-human relations. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
sure. I'm Chris Branciere, and I'm a biofeedback practitioner. That's kind of where I get my interest in some of this. I have a board certified, and I also am an adjunct professor in biofeedback. I'm also a vegan, and I'm pursuing a PhD in mind body medicine with a specialization in integrative functional nutrition. And
Oh, nice.
one of the main modalities of biofeedback, for those unfamiliar, is neurofeedback. Feedback clinician. I I train people to train up or train down different brainwave frequencies associated with different health states or conditions, relaxation purposes. We do this sort of training with sensors attached to the scalp, and we see in real time frequencies that are going on at different hubs on the cortex. It's all non-invasive, and we can see different neurometrics, the brainwave activity going on, measured in the power.
Hmm.
What's called the relative power is another metric, and then there's three major metrics of interconnectivity: coherence, asymmetry, and phase relationships between the different areas. So we're not just looking at how much power at what frequency is going on at a given site, but then how much is that site talking to another site as the information is being organized. And
Okay,
so
well, we don't have to worry too much about the technical details because neither I nor the audience will understand them. But so long as you do, that should suffice for the arguments that you're going to make.
let me just clarify that I'm not an expert in neuroscience and not even an expert in reading brainwave frequencies. There are neuroscientists that have been doing that for decades, and it's a very uh, art slash science to do that. But I'm interested in stuff anyway, and yeah, I will try not to make it technical, but I don't want to claim that I'm an expert either. I'm still learning like everybody else is.
That's
But
understandable. As long as you can say what you think can be derived from the studies, that should suffice. How long have you been vegan?
about 10 years.
Okay, so that's a lot longer than a lot of the vegans I talk to. So you're definitely one of the longer vegans.
I and I have my opinions on why don't last, of course, which
Well,
I'm not shy about sharing.
that's okay. We don't need to go into that. That would be a completely separate discussion. So you had two studies that you were linking to me. And one of the studies that I was looking at was showing these brain patterns between vegans, I think vegetarians and non-vegans, when they were exposed to, well, how would you describe it? It was like negative situations involving animals and other humans.
So this is the kind of study that you or setup you can use designed for a study in which you present images of um, suffering, but it could be like in this case animal suffering as well.
Hmm.
Result of this study by um, Filippi as well as others that not only did vegans show more activity of the brain associated with empathy whilst viewing those images of animals that are suffering, but they also showed more relative activity in those areas associated with the empathy network, images of human suffering. And the reason this topic came up was that you'll often hear non vegans, or we'll call them anti vegans rather, vegans care more about animals than they do about people, which may be true in some, which is true in some cases, or may seem true in some cases. Left out, the missing part is that they're showing generally more activity in this empathy network because empathy is a skill. It is not restricted to a specific species.
Oh,
Else, if
wait,
the
wait, wait,
empathy
wait.
is
I'm not sure why it would become a skill just because it's not restricted to only humans. Why would that make it a skill and not some sort of innate capability?
well, because that's something else. If you could call it pride, nationalism. That gets into something else. If see, there's a continuum based on the research whereby those species that were more closely related to humans had a stronger empathic response to empathic concern or experienced more empathic distress when viewing those species that were images of those species being harmed, for instance, or suffering.
Hmm.
So the trend is for the closer that species is to humans, the stronger the empathic response is.
I
Um,
suppose I don't really understand what you meant by calling it a skill.
I, well, we function. You could call it a function would be a better term for it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, because I thought by skill you meant it's like maybe something you have to mentally work on as an individual. But I would say that empathy, at least at a default, is like somewhat innately built in to the human psyche.
You're conceptualizing it correctly. Yeah, it's mainly innate, although it's something you can work on. It's something that you don't have to think of. It's not a conscious, not generally a conscious right.
Hmm. So maybe you might say it could be a combination, right? Like something
Yeah,
innately built on, but maybe certain concepts would make it function slightly different.
right. It's a function, not a skill. Yeah.
Okay.
So while we watch others that are suffering, whether it be human or animal, what we're doing is we're utilizing the same neural hardware while watching others perform some behavior or action or suffering as we would be if we were going through it ourselves. That's kind of the nature of empathy.
Right.
Perhaps of the neurons that fire, I've seen this estimate been tossed around. 10% of the neurons are firing that would be firing to the suffering yourself, say, if you're watching somebody else suffer.
Okay.
That's
Oh,
the
that's
basis for,
interesting.
yeah, that's the basis for understanding and empathizing with others.
Hmm. But this can also work as well for like fictional characters, animated characters, that sort of thing. Like we get these sensations from watching those as well, so long as we can identify something in them.
Yes.
Okay. So on I remember looking at the two brains, the charts. The vegans did seem to have more empathy, total overall for both, viewing human distress situations and animal distress situations. I thought it was very interesting that the non-vegans seem to have more empathetic responses towards animal suffering than humans, and the vegans seem to have more for humans than they did for animals, which was not a result I was expecting to see.
Uh, it depends. Yeah, it depends on the location of the area that's being test. So I think it was the amygdala in one of the articles by Felipe as well as others. But let me just give you a little more background to kind of appreciate how complex it is.
Sure.
Research determining that those who have scored low on empathy or compassion actually had some areas of the empathy network that fired up more than those who expressed empathy, according to some assessments. and that those who are experiencing more arousal by the suffering of others are going into a state of dissociation in order to cope with that rather than empathy because they're overwhelmed with their strong arousal. So let
Huh.
me make it clear that low on empathy doesn't mean they don't have a capacity. It may be that they have stronger dissociative that are occurring. So empathy, we're looking at it in a kind of linear way. If we think about the more empathy you have, the higher you're going to test on empathy. It's not as simple as that, like most things. The other factor is now, are you dissociating? You may have moderate levels of empathy. For instance, I don't particularly have a great natural capacity, it seems, to be empathic, or maybe I do, but I haven't realized it. Just have moderate empathy according to just, and you can take these. There's an empathy scale. There's a dissociative scale. You can take them online. There's free tests.
Hmm.
I have a moderate, a low dissociation rating and a moderately high empathy rating, and will tell you they were. Many will tell you that they wish they'd gone vegan earlier because they feel guilty for having gone vegan for so long. But that, if they could understand, would just be a, a result of having dissociative defenses in play before turning vegan. That's the way they explain it. It's not that they had this great insight all of a sudden. It's that they had a breakthrough because the dissociative defenses were relaxed or found to be non-effective at some point, at some threshold, and then they turned vegan.
Okay.
The
So
capacity
would
was
that be
there.
more common for someone with high empathy but also high disassociation?
Yeah, that's the thing. If your dissociation is high and your empathy is not higher, then you might not make the transition.
Hmm. Okay. So when I was looking at the brain thing, it seemed like the back section was uh, the more active for the vegan side, but the frontal section, as I was noting, seemed higher for the non-vegans. Do you know what that section regulates or why that would be the case?
So I'm speculate here, uh, but my understanding is that with those areas, the frontal areas working. I see. I'm looking at the 2010 article,
Hmm.
and when you talk about the frontal areas, we're talking about inhibiting. And so, if there's more effort required to inhibit, then those areas are going to be overactive, the norm.
So you're
There's
saying
less.
they're more inhibitors?
Frontal areas have more to do with inhibiting.
Okay.
In fact, that's mainly what they are for: inhibiting impulses, inhibiting fears. Talking about a fear.
Okay.
Uh,
So why is that a section associated with empathy then in the study?
so that has a lot to do with the dissociative, but as well as empathy. If we get into the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, or the front of the cingulate cortex that surrounds the limbic system, driven, then we're talking about allowing that information to determine what we're going to actually do about it, how we're going to reach out into the world and cope. And that's what the front does. It does a lot of regulating. If you don't have strong regulation, then you will be very impulsive, for instance. A
Okay.
major.
Okay. Okay. So would you say then that would translate to saying vegans are feeling more empathy towards things, but they're also more impulsive off of those sensations than non-vegans?
They're regulating more effectively.
The non-vegans.
The vegans are regulating more efficiently. The non-vegans would have to power up in the front with more effort to try to regulate their impulses.
I'm not sure I follow how that's the case. If the studies are showing more activity for the non-vegan in the frontal section, Why are you saying you're saying that they need to power them up more?
Yes,
Because why?
we're looking at fMRI data, which is
Uh-huh.
blood flow, which can show up with low brainwave frequencies or high brainwave frequencies. So there's a basic difference here with fMRI data and data or EEG data, and that is when you look at the EEG, you see more slow wave activity in vegans, or not necessarily non-vegans, but those who are dissociating in general, relative to those who are not dissociating more. So if there's more dissociation, best as either low fast wave activity or high slow wave activity. And I know that's confusing and abstract, but it is not a simple linear. And so the area in the frontal lobe, when it's overactivated, either one is inefficient. If it's overactivated, it's more effort is going into trying to regulate activated. The resources aren't there to do that, and it may feel as though you're expending more energy to try to regulate, but the resources aren't there.
If well, I guess what I don't understand though is if the non-vegans have less empathy, there's less activity going into the empathy section. What is it they need to regulate more of?
It's not that they have less empathy necessarily, it's that they're efficiently regulating whatever impulses there are that they're trying to regulate. Create if they have to use an abundance of resources, it's not efficient. They're not efficiently regulating.
If they have to use an abundant, but what do they need to use the abundant of resources on?
So if the non-vegans are using more resources in order to regulate proportionate amounts of resources,
Right. So you're saying the non-vegans are using more resources to regulate, but I'm not sure what they're using more resources to regulate. Like, what is the thing that they're regulating that they need
the
all these resources for?
arousal, empathic distress, while they're being challenged, if we're talking about while they're being challenged, while viewing images of others who are suffering, which
Uh-huh.
require more effort to do that.
Now, does that show up in any of the brain scans? Like, why are we saying that's the case?
Uh, like I said, I'm speculating if that's what's showing up is the high frontal activity, like the frontal lobes in charge of,
Uh-huh.
particularly some of what may appear as discrepancies. But again, it's very complex. So consider, and this is why I probably should give a little background. There's 86 billion neurons in the central nervous system, most of them in the brain. One of those neurons is separated by more than 3 degrees, so it's highly interconnected. And most of the metrics to read what's going on in the brain are based on interconnectivity. More is known about the power, less is known about the interconnectivity. And these are not old studies that we're looking at with Felipe. They are just groundbreaking or pioneering research in the field. But since that time, there's other studies, and again, this is fMRI data, EEG data, which is more the perspective I'm coming from. What you find is that there tends to be more of the delta and theta brain waves associated with slowing among those who are dissociating. Less interconnectivity, and that's the common theme. You're seeing less interconnectivity, which is going on. So when someone goes into a dissociative state, what they're doing is they're restricting information from flowing from one area of the brain to the other, especially in more of the long range uh, distances across the cortex from the lobe to the frontal lobe. You're seeing less interconnectivity going on. Information
Okay.
is getting compartmentalized and restricted. I
Okay.
know that's a
It,
mouthful.
yeah, it's just a little harder for me to understand the different possibilities of what that could mean. Um,
It
but
is hard to
yeah, so I'm gonna go into some more details about the study so you can kind of give some context on them. Do you know what the sample sizes or how the people were chosen for the study?
know that there were small samples, and in the first one there was about 65 or so in the first one,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe the second one was a sample of uh what no, I don't know the sample in the second one.
Okay.
I
And do
I
you
was thinking
know
about it.
do you perhaps know what they used as a definition for vegan? Because I've seen some studies that define vegan as people who eat meat like once a week or less. So I was just curious if you knew the strictness of like the definition of vegan for the studies.
I don't think they went into the details about that in the study. Small sample, I would expect them to have a stricter definition, especially since they divided it up into vegans, vegetarians, vegans.
Well, even the Adventist study allowed for some vegans to eat I think it was like once a month they could eat meat, and
That's right.
and they
They
also
did.
had a vegetarian category.
That's true.
So
Yep.
it's
And
not
that
always the case, but I guess if they don't say, then we can only hope that vegan, has a more strict definition.
yeah, I would expect it, but
Okay. So one of the things that we were hinging on, like this information is interesting, but one of the things we want to know is how do we think this plays out as human behavior? Because one of the stronger arguments towards a non-vegan who cares about human to human relationships is how does this empathy play out in human to human relationships? Are we going to say it's always better? Can it be sometimes worse? Like, what's your perspective on that?
so this topic does come up when people get into it, and it's a good question. Can you have too much empathy, and could that be part of the problem among those who are vegans, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
Well, having this kind of discussion 10 or 15 years ago because so much of this is new information. There are risks to having low empathy for sure.
Yeah,
Continuum.
it does seem like that seems like an intuitive understanding is like no empathy. If we pictured no empathy, then we'd be in a fairly disastrous state. It seems like almost all social creatures need some form of it.
How common psychological disorders are really. Um, there's subtle conditions. There's continuums. I view it as continuums on virtually all the psychological disorders. So when we talk about people with low empathy or high dissociative or traits. We're talking about increased comorbidities of obsessive compulsive disorder, alexithymia, inability to express your feelings, and in more extreme cases, dissociative identity disorders or fugue states where people severe memory deficits. And again, there are some of these tests tested dissociative states and dissociative traits. So those who have more dissociative disorders or personalities that are marked by habitual dissociation are going to be at increased risk. But there's also studies showing those who have dissociative traits relatively frequently have some of the same risks, and that is not necessarily fugue or amnesia,
Hmm.
but short-term, just slight impairments in short-term memory that might not have even been attributed to dissociative uh, states before. You, when you have acute dissociative states chronically, it ends up evolving into dysfunctional uh, dissociative traits. And so to have a trait, it's part of your personality. It's something. The more you do something, the more so. There's an old saying, "What fires together wires together," by Donald Hebb, father of neuroscience. And if you keep doing a behavior repeatedly, you're creating neural pathways that make it easier to go in and do that.
Hmm.
Pathways from coming in to play. So increased psychopathologies or comorbidities for psychopathologies, and the probably the best argument for maybe you want to reduce your empathy or not let it be too high is bringing up the example of occupations such as surgeons or physicians in general who will, in the short term, benefit from reducing the amount of empathy they feel for the patient because if they get too involved, they get too enmeshed with their patient, then it would disrupt their objectivity and their focus in the task at hand. And this is true in the short term. So, like passive aggressiveness or like anger or like a lot of things, if you're able to do something in limited ways or in certain conditions, it can be actually helpful. So for the physician or the surgeon who temporarily limits the empathy they feel, this can be functional for them. This can be effective in the short term. But these physicians also, the more they do it, the more they're prone to and anxiety, and it doesn't help their empathic development, their emotional development in the long run if they're chronically restricting empathic distress or dissociating from empathic concern.
In the example we were talking about earlier with like fictional characters, like a Disney movie or something, would you say, it has a physiological deficit to disassociate from those? Or would you say that's a benefit?
So, with the case of fictional characters, they're used for children typically to teach manners, for instance, or morals as they're growing up. So, they're typically there's a what is the term I'm using for it? The main character of a fictional uh,
The protagonist?
video or play. The protagonist, yes, thank you. So the protagonist is usually one that has these traits that maybe is the underdog in a story, and we want to identify with the underdog as humans are prone to doing.
Hmm.
Some moral, the story that comes about, and by witnessing or carefully listening to and reflecting upon these stories of fictional characters, this is one way that's been proposed in the literature to improve empathy or to fulfill that empathic capacity. And there's not a lot of strong evidence. There's not much evidence at all showing this is the case, but there is a little bit of evidence showing that this is effective. And advertisers know this. And so they try to steer clear of using certain animals in certain ways that would trigger empathy in others when they're advertising their products for like fast food, for instance.
Hmm. No,
I don't know if that answers.
I wouldn't be surprised by that. But what I'm thinking here is that like in these cases of these fictional stories, what we want the children to take is like abstract lessons from it. Like to think of the general concepts. We don't want them to focus on the particular, as in to say that they actually want to save the cartoon character from harm, right? We want them to take more of an abstract idea of good behavior from it.
Right, and it's not so much a threat that they would do as they develop. They'll be able to differentiate, but fulfilling that empathic capacity is the main goal.
So would you
I
say
think
this, don't you think this differentiation is sort of a disassociation, right? Like I want you to disassociate from the actual cartoon character itself, but I want you to associate with the general lessons of behavior.
that would be more specifically discrimination instead of dissociation. So that would be a different psychological function. So as long as we can discriminate, that's a different function that's being used. Um, then they wouldn't be strictly, no, it's not strictly dissociation by just understanding coming to understand that fictional character is not the real. And there's the threat that how are they going to separate the two? Are we really teaching over empathy at that point if they're identifying with cartoon characters? But that's a different psychological function involved in that, and they could maintain all the empathy, dissociating if they critically evaluate what it is that they're empathizing with, and that is a cartoon character.
Um,
So
I think that might be a little confusing because if I were to say that someone, thinks about an animal and then decides not to empathize with it, you would call that disassociation. But if they did it with a cartoon character, you would call it differentiation. And I'm not sure I see the clear, distinct difference.
right, and that's a good point you raise. And so if you understand that to maintain dissociation, there's two major a methods that's done. One is through imagination, and so that kind of conflicts with this scenario here because what you're asking is if the child potentially could learn to differentiate. And what I'm saying is that they would have to cast themselves into more of an imaginative state in order to maintain um, a view that there's no difference between the animal, the cartoon, and what's real. And so dissociation, restricting information, and one of the main ways that's maintained is through imagination, or there's another, absorption is the other. Remain absorbed in a task, like the physician does, remains absorbed in a task to gate off environmental input in order to complete a task. But that's a different situation. But so through absorption or imagination, dissociation is maintained without, if you're not going into an imaginative state. And that is the child who is able to differentiate, not get the imaginative part confused. I know that's abstract.
Well, given that we don't actually view, other people's subjective states or animals' subjective states, right? To some degree, we have to say this is abstract or imaginative, right? Because I'm not actually viewing your perspective. I'm assuming your perspective exists, and I'm
Yes, so
associating with that.
imagination is generally required in these cases particularly. But you have to imagine what it's like for another subject to experience what that subject's seeing or perceiving in order to fully empathize to some degree.
So that's why I'm not seeing this clear-cut distinction between a fictional character and an animal character because some level of imagination has to be put into both of them. But then we're going to say one is differentiation because we're very confident it's not real. And then the other one, we're less confident that it's not real.
Yeah. So in one case, the imagination outlives its effectiveness in maintaining empathy, and the other, it's not required. So yeah, there's that going on, but they're two different. They are two different imagining and empathizing. But there is some overlap. There is a little overlap. So there's a little gray area, especially in this extreme, case that you brought into play. And so this is, we're talking about cartoon characters, and they certainly can be used for people who are imaginative as ways of maybe sparking some empathy or developing empathy. These are not as effective um, with have higher levels of empathy, basic levels of empathy that you're referring to. These are kind of extreme examples with cartoons, but no, I mean, they're relevant questions. It's how empathy is fostered to some degree.
Yeah, I suppose
Some
that's my point is that I can't imagine empathy existing without some level of imagination, which is why I can't see these two situations different, other than, after our reasoning about it, that obviously cartoon characters aren't having real experiences, and we might be less confident about animals in that regard. So if it's all about reasoning that differentiates these things, it seems like it's not really a part of the empathetic process.
Right, right. So for sure, there's definitely overlap. Linear, it's complex, and so that would be maybe a way of starting to understand where some empathy could be encouraged at the same time that the individual would actually be wrestling with being overly imaginative if they but they'd be able to tease that out. They're not mutually exclusive. That's the thing. If you could tease out not at some point, then the function of empathy is still developed to some degree, but it would be limited because these are cartoon characters. So you'd
Mm-hmm.
expect it to be limited, just like it's going to be you're going to have limited empathy for potentially a roach or a rat, or less so with a chimpanzee or orangutan. As you get closer to humans' natural form, you're going to have more empathy.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's expected. We definitely have different attitudes towards things with eyes and things that don't have eyes. That's like one of the bigger draws for the empathetic response. Um, especially when people, if they show the videos of pigs, and pigs have very human-looking eyes, whereas in, an animal that has like a pure black eye is harder to empathize with a human for a human.
And females have more empathy than males do. Components for this. There's environmental reasons for that too, because of the gender roles that are promoted.
Mm-hmm. It just
Back
shows how
to
biological machines we are. Uh, but I suppose my point is that if rather than a function of empathy, reason has to come into play to determine which empathy makes sense to apply and which one doesn't, then I'm not sure why having more empathy necessarily would be a good thing. It seems more of a determining factor of do you have enough, and is your reasoning capabilities good at managing it? In which case, that would be the determining factor of human to human relationships.
I'm just thinking about this for a second. Do you have the question you're posing is whether you have enough empathy, and what was
Well,
the other part to it?
well, I think we both agree that low empathy would be a problem, right? But if we have a non vegan and a vegan, even if the vegan has more empathy, it seems to be whoever can reason more about it, like the correct application for that empathy, would be the one who fares off in better behaviors, right? So
Okay,
somebody who has a lot of empathy for a cartoon character but can't reason whether they should or not would find themselves with worse behaviors than somebody who could reason about that.
okay. So this brings up another issue, and that is that most decisions are made based on emotions very quickly, especially if you're talking about related behaviors. Empathy is a spontaneous function. It's not something that you're strictly reasoning about.
No, I don't think so either. But
Or
I
spontaneous,
might think this for more long term behavior.
but it's spontaneous. So a person, when they can hold their empathy in check by going into dissociative state spontaneously. That's the threat to empathy, is the spontaneous dissociation.
But what about this more differentiation we were talking about, like when it comes to cartoon? Is that not an effective function that we can use?
In a conscious way is what I think you're getting at.
Yeah, well, even unconsciously.
Well,
I'm not big on what consciousness does for humans. So I probably wouldn't make that argument because I really don't think consciousness plays that much of an agency role.
yeah, and I want to get into this, but unfortunately, I'm limited on time.
Okay.
I, I,
So would you like want to just pick this up and do a part two later? Because I think we got a lot of good stuff in here.
yeah, and we'll have direction going forward too.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. So it was nice having you on. I'll have you on another time, and then we'll finish this up. And I'm gonna upload this. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We'll pick up shortly then. I'll be in touch.
Okay, I'll see you later, Chris.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.